Welcome to this first of our 4 Holy Week lectures. It's hoped that over the next 4 sessions we might be able to delve a little bit deeper into the true meaning of Holy Week and its ritualistic element. We might be able to explore a little more the symbolism that we all take so much for granted in our daily church lives. This first lecture is entitled Who and Why. Before I get into the lecture proper, perhaps a short introduction would be in order. We live in a society deeply infused with the Christian story, but it is often claimed that in recent years, the reasons why Christianity has traditionally followed certain patterns and rituals have become blurred and misunderstood as life has become busier and more complex. There is much evidence to suggest that underlying elements of belief have begun to be eroded and confused, not just in wider secular society, but also for many self-confessed believers and churchgoers alike. It's often claimed that one example of this is the way in which so many cease to recognise the importance of committing themselves and their families to regular church attendance. Some commentators also claim that even for many who do attend church, the reasons for them coming have become confused as well, with some not coming because of any active faith necessarily, but more because of a social network of friends, or an attraction to a building, or a desire simply to be entertained. Church is never entertainment. There will be times when one may feel at the height of spiritual experience in church, and there will be times when it will feel quite empty spiritually. That's more to do with one's individual spiritual journey than anything else. So if one comes simply looking for entertainment, then everyone's in trouble. All of these reasons would explain why some churches have struggled to change, adapt and grow. And one only has to look at the sociology of religion section of any theological library to see the vast array of evidence and commentary on church decline. But there is cause for hope. Attendances on occasions such as Easter and Christmas show an increase in recent years, especially at cathedrals and civic churches, where they tend to do symbolism bigger and better. Young people have also shown in recent years to be spiritually curious, even if they have no traditional association with church. All of the evidence would suggest that what they're looking for is depth, meaning, and integrity in the way that the church community conducts itself. So if our churches can begin to present church in a more coherent and symbolically rich way, then there is much hope. The routine cycles of the church help us to walk the journey together with hundreds of other Christians locally and billions of other Christians worldwide. We cannot do it alone. We need the church community just as much as the church community needs us. Nowhere is walking together in love more transformative for us than during Holy Week and Easter. The events of Holy Week and Easter are central to Christian faith. They also transform our understanding of life itself. Over the next few days, these lectures will look to unlock some of the richness to be found within the events of the last week of Jesus' life, death and resurrection. We will discover how they suggest a living God whose care and compassion for the world is so immense that he is willing to put himself in harm's way in order to offer humanity a chance of a richer way of being, a way of living freed from the tyranny of sin and death, and if we're open enough to it, the ultimate promise of eternal life. During this, our first lecture, we will look at who Jesus is, claimed to be, and the backdrop to his coming. We will explore, albeit rather too briefly, the importance of the Old Testament narrative and our understanding of Christ, and the two together, and why the Old Testament narrative is so important to that understanding. For without this, the meaning of the Last Supper, the cross and the resurrection is entirely lost. In our second lecture, we will then move to look in more depth at the Last Supper. Why does Christ convene this rather strange banquet, just moments before he knows he will be arrested and killed? And why do the authors include the bits they do in their narratives? Why do they feel that those particular points are so important? In the third of our series, we'll take a look at the significance of the sacrifice of the cross and what it means for us personally. We all have to die, so why is Jesus' death special? And what can it tell us about how we're to live a good life? And as importantly, how we may die a good death. Then in our final lecture, we will look beyond the grave and reflect on the resurrection. Such an unbelievable event, what can it possibly offer us today in a world where we think we hold all the answers except maybe one? What happens after we die? What's the meaning of life? How can Christ's resurrection transform the way we view the world and each other? These lectures will not look to be apologetic. That is, their main purpose is not to convert. Their intention is simply to present the facts as they are commonly known, reveal some of the pillars of Christian belief, and look at why the Church has traditionally and continues to offer the rituals it does on Maundy Thursday, Good Friday, and Holy Saturday moving into Easter Sunday, known as the Sacred Triduum, 3 days of immense sanctity and awe. It will be helpful if each person can have the accompanying notes from the website on this lecture. At some moments, I will make direct reference to references there, but at other times I will not, in order to keep the conversation flowing. Either way, those notes will provide some greater depth and underlying evidence for the claims I am making. So let's begin then. Who was Jesus? Having got the introductions to these lectures out of the way, let us briefly start by thinking about who Jesus was and whether he was even a real person. There is a huge amount of evidence to suggest that Jesus lived and that the events we read about in the New Testament actually took place. In fact, there doesn't appear to be any substantiated historical evidence to suggest that Jesus wasn't a real person. Interestingly, there is more evidence that Jesus lived than for many of the Roman emperors. In the New Testament and the writings of the early church, we seem to have evidence for Jesus' life from a huge variety of individuals, and a good proportion of this evidence seems to originate from eyewitnesses who lived at the time of Jesus himself. But the evidence for Jesus' existence is not only from Christian sources, also reliable and Jewish and Roman ones as well. These include Tacitus, an eminent Roman historian, Pliny the Younger, a Roman governor of Bithynia in Asia Minor, and Josephus, a respected Jewish historian. You can see their testimonies in the lecture notes online. They all add up to some compelling evidence. These individuals all view the Christian faith as a threat. And whilst they're not always very complimentary about Christians as a group, their evidence adds huge weight and validity to the claim that Jesus actually lived and died in the way the Holy Scriptures describe. Given all this weight of evidence, I think it reasonable to say that Jesus was certainly a real person. But who was Jesus, and what was so special about him? Jesus' teachings regularly challenged cultural norms. He was a controversial figure at the time of his ministry, just as he is today. He tells us to love poverty and simple living, whilst the world teaches that to be rich and accumulate possessions is to succeed. He tells us to forgive sinners when the world would much rather we condemn them. To love and forgive our enemies. And all the time the world encourages us to attack, subdue, bully, and overcome those who stand in our way. To seek stillness and silence with God, when the world teaches us that we are rewarded through our busyness and activity. On the face of it, Jesus is a very complex figure too. One minute he is a radical turning over the tables of loan sharks and money changers in the temple because they are bringing God's house into disrepute. The next he is the conformer, teaching that his disciples should pay taxes and obey the law. He teaches that he comes not to bring peace but to bring a sword, detailing how those who follow him will find themselves at odds with the authorities, with their families, with friends and their communities. Then, even though he was about to be arrested and tried for blasphemy, he tells Peter to put his sword away because violence is never the answer. Of course, I oversimplify things to prove a point, but you get the picture. As complex as it might seem, Jesus is above all a reconciler, and it is perhaps from this perspective that anyone wanting to understand Jesus better should begin. Jesus understands his calling on earth to be primarily about helping the human race to live in the way it is designed to. In simple terms, that means being as least destructive to our environment and each other as possible. Being kind and shrinking our footprint, if you will. Jesus shows us that to properly live is to make things grow and blossom, such as putting our energy into making relationships flourish with both those we love and those we hate, reordering our lives in order to nurture the living things around us, and making sacrifices in our desires to do so, setting aside proper time to develop and grow our relationship with God the Father. But Jesus doesn't allow us to collude with those who act in unjust ways just to avoid conflict. Quite the reverse. He demands that we promote the dignity and equality of all and stand up to those who would distort the world for their own ends. That doesn't sound very peaceful, does it? And sometimes it isn't. How many of us consider ourselves to be hard-working Christians trying our best, but cower in the corner when we see the bully coming at us from afar, or even worse, coming at someone else? Jesus doesn't allow that response. He demands we stand up to those who would oppress others. But having said that, this doesn't mean being an anarchist by speaking or acting in an aggressive or unthinking way towards anything or anyone that we disagree with or annoys us. For that would be to become the bully ourselves. Notice how Jesus challenges hypocrisy and unfairness in the Gospels. He is very careful about the battles he chooses and the words he uses. He speaks out about important issues in a balanced way. The outcome is always to return dignity to the person most afflicted. he usually accompanies this by good works. He gets stuck in to setting a good example and showing a better way of going about things. And then he doesn't just leave the individual there to return back into the same messiness that they have come from. He poses them a challenge. Do not continue as you have been. Change and walk more in tune with God. Here, I have shown you how. Or words to that effect. A really good example of this is the story of the woman caught in adultery we see documented in John's Gospel. Notice how he challenges and nurtures that lady in equal measure. He protects her, stops her from being stoned, and then he challenges her because he realizes that if she just goes back to her old way of living, then it won't be too long before she's back in the same place again. But the moral teaching and good works that Jesus encourages are a part of something much bigger than just showing human beings how to live better and be kinder to each other. It's all a part of a much grander aspiration. Jesus clearly felt that he had been given a responsibility to return humanity back to God the Father, to mend the broken relationship, if you will. The moral action he teaches is a part of this. He shows us that being kind to each other is one aspect necessary to repair that relationship, but there is much more to it than just that. The testimony from the time, both from within the Jewish tradition and outside of it, all points to a widely recognized fact that Jesus and his followers felt sure that he was God's Son, the Messiah, sent to free God's people from their oppression and to show humanity what it meant to live a life the way it was designed to be lived, in full relationship with God. The final days of his life, death and resurrection are pivotal to this. The circumstances of and the way he responds to his greatest earthly trial is extremely significant. But we come to that in a later lecture. For now, it is worth noting that modern scholarship has challenged us to think hard about Jesus' situation in order to understand him. The eminent scholar Brant Petrie reminds us, Jesus is firmly rooted in the Jewish religious situation. Jesus was a Jew. He was born to a devout mother and received the Jewish sign of circumcision. He grew up in the Jewish town of Galilee. As a young man, he studied the Torah, the Jewish scriptures. He celebrated the Jewish feasts and holy days and went on pilgrimages to the Jewish temple in Jerusalem. When he was 30 years old, he began teaching and preaching in the Jewish synagogues about the fulfillment of the Jewish scriptures and proclaiming the kingdom of God to the Jewish people. So Jesus was certainly a Jew, and a very devout one at that. In other words, Jesus was religious. It's not very trendy in Christian circles to call Jesus religious nowadays, but he absolutely was. As we study Jesus' words and actions more closely, we see that everything Jesus did seems to be intentional to the wider project. Not a single word or action is lost as he gives the human race the perfect human example that it has been waiting for. And he reveals the purest route back to God. Therefore, we have no option but to conclude that rituals and religious observance were as much a part of Jesus' example as his teaching and other actions. There was something about ritual, there was something about his religiosity that grounded him in the Father. This is a point that many modern teachers of the faith seem to skirt or be embarrassed by. Maybe this is because they deem it to be at odds with our secular culture and what our secular culture wishes to hear. But that's irrelevant, because it is an essential point to make, and one we can't make often enough. Jesus could not have secured our salvation without being completely obedient in his observance of the traditional ritualistic Jewish faith. We will begin to recognise this more fully in later lectures, when we come to looking more closely at the events of the Last Supper and crucifixion. Please now move to part 2 of this lecture, which is found in a separate video file. Thank you.